In a fragmenting world. As many of you tuning in online know, this conference is a joint effort of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore and represented and led here by Dean Danny Quah. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, which partners with the LKY School on this annual event. We were grateful last night to have Singaporean Trade Minister Young speak, and as in the tradition we've had last year of having foreign minister speak and the previous year the then senior minister, now President Tharman, speak, we've seen Singaporean leadership commit not just to the spirit of this conference but to the spirit of engagement that countries that are not named the U.S. and China can play a constructive role in the global economy in partnership in the region and with others throughout the world. Today we're going to be continuing and picking up on that theme with our second On the Record session with His Excellency Ambassador Zhang Zhenzhang, who is the WTO Deputy Director General. I will speak and try to give him an adequate introduction momentarily. This morning, we are starting off with trade, but also with a key emphasis on climate, and those two themes are going to be running throughout our conference. After this session, we will be going into another day and a half of Chatham House Rules active discussion among the 70 or so distinguished folks who are joining us in person here in Singapore. If you're intrigued, and you should be, and you'd like to be on the invite list for next year's conference, please let us know. But then at the end of the day tomorrow, we will be having the Monetary Authority of Singapore Director Ravi Menon, who of course is also chair of the Greening the Financial System Committee of the Global Central Banks, to close out the conference on the record with a final wrap-up by Danny. For those of us who were here for dinner last night, you got to hear Danny give a too generous introduction to me, and I am due to give an insufficiently generous introduction to Danny. Professor Danny Quah is Dean and Lee Ka-shing Professor in Economics at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy since May of 2018. He is also a commissioner on the Spence Stiglitz Commission on Global Economic Transformation and serves on the Executive Committee of the International Economic Association. I should note that for those of you in the room who don't know this, Danny is one of the leading applied macroeconomists of his generation and has since gone on to do important work with formal insights and political implications on the international political economy, on issues of foreign policy and security from an economic perspective, and on the environment. He is also vice chair of Singapore's Advisory Committee on Platform Workers. Previously, many of us knew, and some of us even learned directly from Danny as LSE Professor of Economics and International Development, and prior to that had been faculty at MIT. He's been a council member of Malaysia's National Economic Advisory Council and holds degrees, a bachelor's in economics from Princeton and a PhD in economics from Harvard. As I said last night, I'll only repeat the one sentence. Danny achieves what many of us strive for, to be analytically sound, to be intellectually honest, to be policy relevant, and to be courageous in speaking truth. And with that, I'm hoping to have a great discussion today. Following Danny's opening remarks, we will have Ambassador Zhang Zhenzhang. Ambassador Zhang has been WTO Deputy Director General since May of 21. He formerly served as Vice Minister in the Ministry of Commerce of China, including representing China in the WTO in a number of regional fora and international and bilateral discussions. He had been China's permanent representative to the WTO and previously deputy permanent representative. He spent more than 30 years of career with MOFCOM and as working at the front of international trade, including as director of the Department of International Trade and of Economic Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Economic Cooperation. He's been director of the Department of WTO Affairs at China. and he is a master's in international relations and a PhD in international politics from Peking University. So he is actually Ambassador Dr. Xiangjiang Zhang, His Excellency. May I invite you to the podium?
Good morning. It's my great honor to be here to participate in the Next Step Global Conference. Actually, last time when I met Adam was in Beijing in 2014. At that time, China and the United States had moved beyond the honeymoon period. But the two sides still had a sound coordination mechanism, such as ICED, the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, and the GCCT, the Joint Committee on Trade and Commerce. The GCCT Secretariat I oversaw had 12 working groups. Compared to 10 years ago, it feels we are living a different world. Recently, some contacts between the United States and China have been restored, and I'm happy about that, but it's more difficult to restore trust than contacts. In the United States, some people call the contact the zombie contacts. And in China, someone said that is playing a piano to a call, which means the mismatch between the effort being putting in and the expected outcome. The topic of conference today is fragmentation. And actually 10 years ago, we also talked about fragmentation. Fragmentation was a good and a positive term at that time. It was about the unbundling and the offshoring of a global value chain, the tasks. But the fragmentation we are talking about now is the reallocation of production back to home countries, which is exerting a negative impact on the global welfare due to reduced efficiency, increased the costs, and hindered the innovation. It is bringing us to the historical pattern of production from unbundling to rebundling, from offshoring to reinshoring, from outsourcing to insourcing. The 2023 edition of World Trade Report, published in last September, found that the fragmentation is already taking place. First, trade environment has become less predictable, and in some cases, less friendly than before. For example, following the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, over 100 export restrictions on food and fertilizer were imposed. This put a large number of population in many poor countries in the high risk of starving to death. Second, trade flows have been continuously affected by headwinds such as skepticism about globalization, industry policies, and geopolitical tensions, leading to the fragmentation of trade along with regional and geopolitical lines. Apart from the fragmentation of trade policy and trade flows, I would like to note two other important aspects of fragmentations. One is the fragmentation of investment, and the other one is the fragmentation of technologies. The uncertainty caused by the geopolitical tensions is not conducive to long-term investment planning. Business tend to delay major investment until there's more clarity on policies. With regard to the fragmentation of technology, the United States is implementing the small yard, high fence strategy on competition with China in strategic sectors such as 5G, semiconductors, AI, and several other emerging technologies. While it is still too early to assess the effect across the sectors, we can expect that with the non-compatible technological competition between China and the United States going forward, the world will break into two systems in these areas. Given the essential infrastructure nature of such technologies, the implication will go far beyond those sectors themselves. Those geopolitical tensions have put many enterprises and small economies in a dilemma. They are hastening to make a choice. So we do see initial sign of fragmentation. Of course, we do not see evidence of broad-based deglobalization. So this is our assessment. The index of agglomeration of global trade, the method of the global value chains experts of examining possible evidence of reassuring showed little evidence of reassuring activities from 2019 to 2021. However, if we do not do anything on the fragmentation, then the impact would be huge. Many international organizations have analyzed the overall impact of decoupling and the fragmentation. A joint research done by the economists of WTO and the University of California, San Diego in 2022 simulated the impact of the economic decoupling between the East and the West. They found that the projected welfare losses for some regions of the world would be as larger as 12%. And the IMF estimates that due to the fragmentation of investment, long-term global output losses are close to 2% of world GDP. And the losses are likely to be unevenly distributed, with emerging market and developing economies being particularly affected. WTO's Global Value Chain Report 2023, the draft, which will be published, makes a deep look at the impact of geopolitical tensions on the semiconductor industry and presents 3 possible scenarios for the future of the global value chain in this sector throughout the 2020s. The first and the most likely scenario will be the muddling through of current policies. The United States and the European Union will obtain more capacity for chips production. But this additional capacity will be relatively modest and will not fundamentally reshape the competitive landscape of the global value chain. The second scenario would be more radical. The United States or China makes a revolutionary breakthrough in the production method and the industry shifts to a new center. The third and most devastating scenario is the escalation of geopolitical competition, government intervention, and even military conflicts, which will fundamentally disrupt or even destroy the value chain. Of course, such simulations are based on many economic assumptions, but I think their greatest usefulness is to serve a warning to the world. None of the effects I have mentioned before is positive. How to manage this situation in such a volatile and uncertain world, our expectation cannot be too high. Realistically, what we can do is to call for restoring communications, working together where both sides see the benefits, managing fragmentation, and avoiding the worst case scenario. This also requires joint efforts of all stakeholders. Business needs to make careful decisions. While the era of zero inventory is over and the diversification of supply chain is inevitable, companies need to find a delicate balance between risk aversion and profit seeking. The government needs to stabilize bilateral relationships through dialogue and communication. The United States and China should seek a relatively stable bilateral relationship while acknowledging their difference. Maintain smooth and effective institutional communication at all levels without interruption due to any individual events, and refrain from adopting irrational or excessive measures in response to the other's action in various areas, including trade and the economic field. The WTO needs to be reformed to provide a fundamental guarantee for the stability of global value chains. In the short term, structural reforms are unrealistic, but incremental reforms can be expected, as we did at MC 12. In conclusion, I would like to say that globalization has not stopped, and in the process of reconstruction, of reglobalization, new winners will emerge. I hope that more developing countries will seize the opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zhang. Thank you for your opening remarks. Now I'd like to invite Prof. Danny Kuan, Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, to the stage to deliver his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Ambassador, for your sobering assessment, sobering and realistic assessment of where we might go hereafter. We're here, obviously, to talk about the fragmenting global economy. In economics, I'm used to a way of discourse that says that when we look at changes, we distinguish exogenous shocks to the system and endogenous propagation mechanisms. One of the big turnarounds in thinking about these issues on the fragmenting global economy is one is surprised to discover how much of the disturbance, how much of the disruption in the global economy is actually endogenously generated from within the system, rather than due to exogenous disturbances. That calls for a rethink of how we attempt to mitigate and repair the fragmenting global economy. The WTO that we've just heard from is the only global international organization that deals with rules of trade between nations. It is at the heart of ensuring that trade flows, keeping the global economy together, trade flows occur as smoothly and as predictably and as freely as possible. Some of the endogenous disruptions to that take the very concrete form of subsidies, export controls, import sanctions, investment scrutiny. Some of that disruption comes from a re-examination of the future of trade partnerships. Some of that disruption manifests in the way we have to rethink resilience in supply chains. All of these topics are things that will come later in our Next Step program for these 2 days. So I come between a WTO acknowledgement of what's happening in the system and actual things that economists will be discussing later in the program. I thought that I would try and add value, what little I can, to the conversation by trying to fill in the niches that we're probably not going to spend a great deal of time on. I thought here, therefore, I would try and do 3 things that get at the idea of what's happening to the endogenous disruptions. First is I just want to emphasize what Ambassador has said, that going quickly through a quick audit of some facts and attention on how all of us have the impression of a fragmenting global economy. There are those who say when we look at the numbers, it is not as obvious. The relation of external trade with internal commerce, that ratio, according to some World Bank economists, does not seem out of the ordinary at this stage. So for them, in that view, the disruption to the global economy is not as large as many of us might think. There are others who say, despite tariffs and sanctions, the volume of trade that's flowing is still at record highs. So that's not really that much of a disruption. But nonetheless, all of us do have an impression of such fragmentation. And in the arena of trying to deal with endogenous disruptions, perceptions are probably as important as structural reality, facts on the ground. So we need to acknowledge that. But the second thing I want to do is to step back from the economics of what we're discussing and think about underlying factors some good, others bad, some justified, others not so, some economic, others not, others geopolitical. And from there, I want to quickly finish up by looking at where the world stands. My view, and what I want to try and get to, is that as economists, we can continue to rail against the endogenous disruption to the international system. And we can try and continue to seek for an ideal that we well understand. But an alternative is to acknowledge that these geopolitical and other factors are already set in place. And what we must do is acknowledge that we need to operate in a second-best world. The question then becomes how we optimally do that. That we can no longer seek the golden ideal, but we need to look at policy measures, actions that work best for us in a second-best world. So what facts might we first go through quickly? I think many of us have the view that the halcyon days of globalization and integrating global economy reached peak sometime before 2016. And that peak came with a view, the optimism that so many of us held, that economically, culturally, socially, everything made everywhere would become available to anyone, anywhere, at lower and lower cost. And that was an ideal that from the perspective of economic exchange made so much sense. Donald Trump in 2016 sought to confront China through trade protectionism. The Trump administration raised tariffs that in many cases, since the Trump administration, have not just not returned to previous levels, but have been extended. Today, the average US import tariff is about 3%, which doesn't seem that high, but it goes up to close to 20% on average for imports from China. This normalization of how we deal with trade is now reciprocated in variants everywhere else. China has sanctions on Australian wine and minerals. Many of us look at these developments and say that they are driven by political or geopolitical concerns rather than pure economics. And so we go around the world explaining national developments through the lens now of non-economic considerations. Looking forwards, things might well get a lot worse. At this point, this is cheap talk. And obviously many in the room have spoken up against it. But you will all know that Donald Trump in August this year was reported in the Washington Post to be considering, should he come back to the presidency, a universal baseline tariff on all imports to the United States, creating what he called a ring around the US economy, an automatic 10% on everything for all countries. However that comes out, given the history of how we've seen tariffs and other sanctions proceed, many in the world no longer view others, including the United States, but not just the United States. Many no longer view one another as trusted partners. And this is going to escalate in further import controls, export sanctions, investment inspection. Industrial policy is now renormalized as industrial strategy, and we see this around the world. We will have occasion later in this conference to talk through many of these. Now, this is not to say none of this makes sense. When Jake Sullivan gave a talk to Brookings earlier this year, he postulated that one way to think about all of these developments is two very basic principles that even economists would subscribe to. First, that markets don't work the way textbooks and the fundamental theorems of welfare economics say they do. And second, that not all growth is necessarily good growth. There are externalities, there are negative spillovers, there are missing markets, there are environmental challenges. So the state of the world in terms of a fragmenting global economy, I think, in my reading, is real. And however the numbers are shaping up, and as I've described to you, there are some numbers that indicate this is not really as bad as we make it out to be. The rhetoric and the political conversation have made these perceptions more and more concrete. This leads me to why I think we need to, as economists, unpack underlying causes. There's a simple story of sanctions, of economic engagement that leads to this fragmentation. That simple story is that, on the one hand, one nation just when I was getting to the really juicy part of the talk. One nation tells the others, you have destroyed my nation's jobs. You have hollowed out my industry. You have stolen our intellectual property. You have denied us reciprocal treatment, even though we provided to you open markets. And on the other hand, another nation will say, my nation, like every other, has a right to develop and grow, to allow its people to grow rich, to lift them out of poverty. And your policy of containment against me removes this basic right of economic growth and development. And yes, it would force me to abrogate my responsibility to my people. The choice for me is clear. There's an on the one hand this, and on the other hand this. But on both hands, everyone would say, those rules, the ones that you agreed to, you have now broken. You are no longer a trusted partner, and we need a different way ahead. And this underlying idea drives a lot of popular and political leadership thinking in the breakaway from multilateralism, a breakaway from the halcyon days of globalization. And multilateralism, which many economists in the room would feel we need more of, not less of, comes, fortunately or unfortunately, hand with political ideas. Multilateralism for us, economists, might mean a level playing field, clear, transparent rules, access to markets, openness. But in a political setting, multilateralism also means indivisibility, that a grouping, the entire grouping, holds ideals in common. An attack on one is an attack on all. It holds the political ideal of reciprocity, that you treat me the same way I will treat you. And third, that there is a promise for peaceful resolution. All of these things politically are under attack. And it might well be that economists who want to continue to achieve that golden ideal in trade and our version of multilateralism might need to think about how we engage and navigate this political consequence. Because out there, whether as economists we like it or not, it is not just the economic story that drives fragmentation. There's a story that geopolitically, this is a moment of great danger because it is a moment of what international relations scholars call power transition, what in popular parlance has come to be known as the Thucydides trap. That this is a moment where nationalism has become ever more important, populism articulated through political channels have now gone to a point where even discussion of loss of jobs might no longer be primary, but simply serves that political ideal. As economists who want to advise policymakers, we need to recognize this new reality. Our argument might no longer carry the day based purely on economic logic, because so many people now think otherwise. Political leadership that we used to be able to convince through the 60s, 70s, and 80s that whatever happened locally, the gains to the world economy dominated. Those narratives don't necessarily carry the day any longer. So I come to the conclusion of these opening remarks. What should we do? So one approach is to say that the golden ideal of multilateralism as economists envision it, globalization in the sense of free open markets, that's no longer accessible. There are some good reasons for that. There are some terrible reasons why that's no longer accessible. Good reasons might include the need to build resilience, robustness in trade relations, supply chains, not all of which easily fit into our discussions of economic efficiency. But that might be no bad thing. In finance, nobody would tell, no financial economist, no banker would tell their client, find a portfolio that achieves the highest expected return. No, we all talk about risk-adjusted returns. We're quite happy with the idea of there being a trade-off between maximizing expected returns and taking care of risk. Perhaps our discussion of trade and economic exchange going forwards should take the form of resilience-adjusted efficiency, not just traditional efficiency. But that's something we can live with. We lived with that in the transition in the field of finance. Perhaps as economists, we need to live with that in the field of globalization and trade. Let me end with the other actors that I've not mentioned here. I've told you about how the great powers view each other and the actions that they've taken that have now been reciprocated, repeated in arenas everywhere else. 80% of the world lives in neither of the great powers. 80% of the world, last time I looked, is an overwhelming majority. What do this 80% of the world need from the global economy, from the international security agreement? A first thought is that these nations, these other nations, should not subvert their legitimate goals of growth and development to great power conflict that, given the narrative, is taking the form more and more of zero-sum contention or worse. All the rest of the world, in conversations like ours, need to articulate and clarify what it is that they need from the global trading system, recognizing constraints, but not falling into the mold of saying, I'm going to choose to go one way or the other. The old days of thinking about how great power geopolitical conflict was on the one hand between democracy and freedom and totalitarianism and tyranny no longer applies in the world. And we need a more nuanced discussion about economics and geopolitics jointly if we are indeed to repair ties in this fragmenting world. I look forward so much to these next 2 days of conversation. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you, Dean. I would like to invite you to remain on stage, and I'm inviting Dr. Posen and His Excellency Mr. Zhang back onto the stage for their response, and followed by a discussion with the audience. If the audience members have any questions, please proceed to the standing microphones that will be placed in the aisles, or raise your hands so one of our ushers can bring you a microphone. Online participants are invited to leave their questions in the chat box. Please be reminded to identify yourself by stating your name, title, and organization. Anonymous questions will not be entertained. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Ambassador Zhang. Let's get, I guess, right into it. Despite the grim facts that you outline, obviously the WTO is still there. It's still alive. A lot of countries in that other 80% of the world population value it. So maybe, Ambassador, you could say a bit about how you would like, you and the Director General Ngozi and your colleagues would like to move forward from here. What can you do either with or without China and the US? What do you want to see on the agenda for the ministerial coming up?
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Actually, the intensified work is undertaken in Geneva for the preparation of MC13 in next February in Abu Dhabi. And we made some progress. For example, before the senior official meeting several weeks ago, members achieved agreement on the LDC graduation, which extend the tariff preference to those graduate LDC like Bangladesh, Nepal, Cambodia. And the negotiation has been taken for 3 years. So before, not during the MC, before the MC 13, members, including United States, including China, reach agreement on that. So this is an indication that members, if they have the will, they can make some progress. But as I said just now, I don't think the structural reform, for example, on the agriculture subsidies, like industry subsidies, can make a breakthrough in MC13. But the issues like LDC graduation, we can continue make a progress. We can continue to deliver something to the world.
Thank you. Danny, I mean, you ended with some of your broad thoughts on how we can contribute, how to move forward. Could you expand a bit in terms of your vision, what you'd like to see other third countries doing in this context?
Thank you, Adam. Actually, if I may, I'd like to answer that question by hooking it on to what Ambassador has just said about WTO. I think one of the horror pictures that we all have in mind when we think about what's happening with the international trading system is the breakdown of the dispute resolution system, that we are no longer able to take cases of appeal to WTO. And that, of course, is a huge part of what it means to mediate the rules of the global trading system. One of the responses, concretely, that have emerged is this idea of plurilateralism that moves away from full-blown multilateralism. And concretely, given the situation that we're in, a group has formed called the MPIIE, the Multi-Party Interim Appeal Arbitration Agreement, which seeks from a group of smaller nations to set up an alternative mechanism for resolving WTA disputes. It is not meant to replace an actual appellate board when it comes back together again in whatever form it does, but it's meant to, while that is not meeting, actually be able to make decisions for a smaller subset of nations who've subscribed to, signed up to MPIA. And the plurilateral idea is that to be able to be subject to, to be able to make use of this appeal mechanism, you have to agree to abide by the rules of that agreement, which makes sense. But what is interesting is that if you are not in the group, we will pay no attention to you. If you're not in the group, you cannot disrupt the agreements that we have come to. So it sets aside a space for perhaps small groups of nations to undertake a restricted kind of multilateralism. Now, I appreciate that from our economics perspective, that is potentially the beginning of a slide down to a fracturing into a spaghetti bowl of an international trading system. But right now, that's the best that we're able to achieve in a second-best world. And I think that idea, however MPIA comes out, whether it's successful or not, whether it within the course of the next 18 months might get subsumed again by a functioning appellate board, it might well be that this idea of plurilateralism is something that third nations might want to pursue.
Respond, I assume?
I agree with Danny that plurilateral agreement and MPA are important at this moment. It's a second best approach. But I don't think MPA is a substitute to the dispute settlement mechanism. It's not a substitute of everybody. And the bilateral agreement is not a substitute of multilateral trading system. They are the intermediate products. The final target, final objective of us is still the multilateral agreement and multilateral dispute settlement mechanism. Having said that, the future's multilateral framework will be different from the original one, the traditional one. The traditional single undertaking approach. 164 countries have the anonymity, the agreement on everything, and the rules are so stringent, and the enforcement are so strict. It's impossible. We have to reform this kind of approach, give more room to the members, not only the small ones, but also the big ones. So we can have some more creative idea to give some members some room, for example, to opt out some of the agreements, some of the disciplines, the so-called don't participate, don't object. That's the merit of the plurilateral approach.
Sorry, Adam, if I may, can I just sneak in one phrase, which is that I agree completely with what Ambassador says. There are better ways to do this, no question, conceptually. But it also seems to me that we are at a moment where we might take to heart the idea that we can't let the perfect stand in the way of the good. That while we're waiting for the best things to happen, we need to be able to take actions, exercise agency, get things flowing again. And a patch of this kind might be something that we want to experiment with, want to allow to see where it takes us.
I'm going to be editorializing for a second, one notch more positively on this. I'm not sure we need to spend, I'm sure Ambassador Zhang is from the WTO has to, but I'm not sure all of us need to spend as much time teeth gnashing over purist multilateralism. You invoked the spaghetti bowl, Danny. That was the famous debate between Jagdish Bhagwati and Fred Bergston some 30 years ago. And Fred Bergston, in what I frankly think, some of you know he was the founding director of our institute, what frankly I think was his greatest intellectual contribution was what he called open regionalism. And that did, in my view, contribute very much to what becomes APEC and CPTPP. So again, without wanting to throw the baby out with the bathwater, I think we can be even a little bit more positive about that. Let me picking up on something the ambassador said. The WTO and the GATT before it never really got agreements on subsidies code. And as several of my colleagues from Peterson have warned through the years, and we've seen now happen quickly, once you start down the subsidies war, it escalates very quickly, and it's very expensive. And it's very hard to end. What is your thinking, both of you, on either what the WTO or the non-great powers or using MPIIA type structures, anything we can do to stave off the subsidies war or to dial it back?
I think the issues like subsidy can only be discussed and negotiated in the framework of WTO, not bilaterally, not regional, in another regional framework. I used to be the chief negotiator of Sino-Australia FTA, and we negotiate, many issues, but not, the subsidy of cotton, subsidy of maize, because this is a horizontal issue. It's also the case for the other bilateral issues. So the agriculture subsidies, the industry subsidies can only be discussed in the multilateral framework. And just in the last senior official meeting, for the first time in the history of multilateral trading system, there was a serious discussion about industry policy and the subsidy among the senior officials. So I think it's a good progress. Of course, the emphasis of the members are different. The developed country focus on the subsidy of the government for the state-owned enterprises, but the developing countries emphasis on the policy space, the future, their possibility to have their own subsidy programs. But I think now we have the room for the discussions. And maybe it's too early to launch the negotiation on industry subsidy disciplines, but we can have the candidate policy dialogue. The European Union suggests that in the MC13, the ministers can authorize the WTO to have the discussion, structured discussion on industry subsidy and the industry policy, and maybe in the MC14 to launch the negotiation. I think it's a reasonable suggestion. And having said that, I think subsidy raise is already taking place. It's not good especially for the small economies. However, it's not necessarily bad for all the subsidies. There's green subsidies which can help the green transformation. So now I think we can discuss, the members can discuss how to level playing fields on the new subsidies issues, policies.
Adam, I think there's some very specific things to say about subsidies that we'll be getting into later in the conference. And there are also some general points to make. Like you say, this is something that many nations are resorting to, and that the escalation in terms of reciprocation is quite pronounced. So, the US CHIPS Act, the European CHIPS Act are just two very large manifestations of a general sentiment. I suppose the issue is, if we step away from the specifics and we try and think about how these are justified, some of these are justified in terms of national security. Article 21, I think, of the WTO. And, if we come back to the WTO, my feeling is that the organization has never felt that it was its job to arbitrate on issues of national security. Nonetheless, it is part of the Articles of Operation, which might then seem unfortunate. But the fact is that this is now how we think about trade and production, innovation and exchange. It is now a fact of life. And until we can rid ourselves of the idea that we are living in constant threat, that national security is so paramount, we will continue to see manifestations of these kinds of actions.
Thank you, Denny. I'm now going to open up to the floor and our global audience for questions. As Thomas already said, if you're here in the room, please head to a standing mic or raise your hand to have a microphone brought to you. If you're online watching on YouTube, you can enter a question in the question box and it'll probably show up on my tablet. Who would like, yeah.
Jacob Kierkegaard from the Peterson Institute. I'd like to pick up on something that Danny said about the perceptions of fragmentation and how it is in many ways not driven by, there's lots of trade indicators that indicate that it's actually not so bad, quote unquote, right? But I guess my pushback to that would be, well, there are some indicators, and particularly if you look at people-to-people exchanges. If you look at, well, as you will know very well, Danny, students, tourism, business travel, etc. Even obviously COVID was a shock to particularly that aspect of trade. But when we start thinking about what actually shapes perception of fragmentation, I would contend that that is probably a much more sinister reduction in, sort of collaboration or engagement than, whether or not a particular goods has a made in the US or made in China or made in somewhere else stamped on it. And then to the ambassador, if that is true, Is there something, I mean, I'm not saying that the WTO should start doing, immigration policy or something like that, but I mean, mode 4 trade, for instance, is there any space for that? Is that still on the table in any shape or form for MC 13 or beyond?
Thanks. Yours was more an observation to me, not so much a question, but I just want to endorse what you say. There are a number of different levels at this. One is perception of what the multi-trillion-dollar stakes are, in terms of jobs, intellectual property, discovery, open markets. All of those come under a perception rubric. But there's also, as you point to correctly, the people-to-people ties at a very micro level that matter in terms of understanding. It's one thing to say things are written down, here's the clear language. And that's quite separate, that's quite different from how one nation and a culture understands a different nation and a different culture. One of the items in our conversation at dinner last night with Minister Gan was his description of how when he goes to China and he sees leadership and others say, in the long term, we will get this done, they're referring to something generational, maybe even centuries long. Whereas in many other parts of the world, in the long term, we'll get this done means the next election, we will have to do this. So there's misunderstanding at that level, beyond just the misunderstanding about the multi-trillion-dollar things at stake. And I agree with you, and it would be good if we could figure out ways to repair this deficiency. Ambassador?
I think you raised a very interesting question, and you are right. In the past, the developing country focused very much about the mode 4 negotiation, natural person movement. But now it's a less hot issue in the WTO. You know why? Because the digital technological development, developing countries, those farmers, those small businesses, they can take advantage of the mode 1, to do their business. In their village, in their country, they can sell their product. They don't need to move to other countries. So this is a new development. I don't think in the MC13 we will resume the market access negotiation on trading services, but instead we are working with World Bank to launch a digital collaboration with African countries to help them to establish their infrastructure and also the regulatory framework to help those developing countries to catch up with the digital transformation process.
Thank you, Jacob. I see 2 more questions. We'll collect those in a moment. 3 more questions, so I'll actually 4. Oh, this is good. Okay, so I won't add what I was going to add. Let's start at the far back there, that gentleman, and then the woman, the lady in the scarf, and then Shiro, and then.
Sivakumar Velayathan from Nilai University. My question is mainly for Ambassador. And this question is probably from the world down to closer to home. I think for Southeast Asian countries, China is one of the biggest trading partners. There's lots of Belt and Road initiatives in Southeast Asia as well. But I think the big bugbear in the relationship between Southeast Asian countries and China is the South China Sea problem. So maybe you could give us some insights into why this puzzle cannot be solved by both parties, basically.
Before you respond, maybe we'll collect questions 2 at a time so we get them all in. I'm sorry, madam, could you move to that? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Maharani from the Government of Indonesia. I've got 2 questions for all the speakers. The first is, how can ASEAN community play more role in this global economy and also all the disruptions? And then the second is, what do you think on the digital transformation area involved in this disruption of fragmenting world? Thank you.
Over to both of you, whatever you want to respond to.
ASEAN, let me pick up on just the ASEAN point. How can ASEAN play more of a role? ASEAN is a huge player. We have to think, but it's not, of course, a nation with national interests. It has to work through for itself what this collection of 10, 11 nations going forwards how it can make an impact on the international trading system, on the geopolitical conversation. And I think the clearest way you can do that is to continue to emphasize the importance of open markets for it and free flow of investment. I mean, growth in ASEAN, economic prosperity in ASEAN remains tied to what many of us will recognize as just a neoclassical production function. You've got to have physical capital in place, infrastructure to move things around, and you've got to have trained workers able to sell to markets large enough that your own nation with more diminutive spending power might not yet be able to provide. It's a very simple recipe for growth, and that is what matters to ASEAN. I think ASEAN needs to continue to tell that story. Over to you, Ambassador.
And I also think that ASEAN can play a more important role in the WTO's reform, because there are some children in the poster from ASEAN countries, for example, Vietnam, many developing countries from Africa, from Latin America, they want to, follow up the examples of those ASEAN countries who did well in the trade and the investment in the past decades. So the example's role of the ASEAN is quite important. And with regard to the relationship between China and other developing countries and in the southern China Sea, I don't know if you know that in last year's fishery subsidy negotiations, members, including China and the Philippines, they reached agreement on the issue of dispute settlement mechanism on subsidies of fisheries. Basically says that WTO will not touch upon the dispute waters subsidy issues. So I don't think it's wise to bring any political issue to the trade organization.
Thank you. There are two gentlemen at that table. If you could go to the mic, and then a traveling mic to here to table two, please.
Shiro Armstrong from the Australian National University. Thank you very much for that discussion. Danny, you raised the issue of MPIIE as a plurilateral for keeping alive the dispute settlement system and making the rules enforceable. You also raised the issue of Article 21 in the GATT, and this is a question for Ambassador perhaps, but Danny as well. But do you think that that's now a very big gap in the WTO, the national security exception sort of being let out of the box since about 10 years ago, but more recently with the rulings against the United States last December? Is a plurilateral, like a group of countries codifying the national security exception and agreeing to limits or constraints on that, a possible way forward? Or what are the ways forward in getting that national security exception back in some sort of box? Thanks.
Thank you. Sir, if you could go to the mic.
I'm Henry Chan from Cambodia Institute for Cooperation and Peace. I have a question to Ambassador Chiang, is that you talk about the digital trade, and now it seems that there's going to be a looming war over industry standard setting, particularly in the area of telecommunications. Now, just last month, Huawei was the first company in the world to announce their standard on 5G Advanced, or the so-called 5.5G telecommunications. And since the 3GPP in the 4G and 5G, we were able to have an industry standard all over. But now we are going to the 6G negotiations. How is going this industry standard setting going to impact the future trade of digital space? And then will WTO get involved in the industry standard settings? Thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate people being concise with their questions. That's very helpful. Hanku, you have the last one.
Thank you. Han Kuyo from the Peterson Institute. I would like to ask Ambassador Chiang, incorporating this green agenda and then carbon pricing into trading system is really critical and urgent issue. And how do you see the main deliverables on this green issue in MC13? And building on this plurilateralism issue that Danny raised, is there any chance that we could revive this environmental goods and services agreement, this plurilateral, anytime soon? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So again, you guys have your choice of which to address.
Okay, on the digital transformation, I think it's very important for the developing country is to open their minds, to look at the offensive interest despite the different difficulties you are facing. And several years ago, when Jack Ma went to Geneva for the e-commerce week, and some African countries asked him the question about digital transformation and argued that we have no infrastructure, we have no skill for workers, we have no regular framework. And the response from Jack Ma was that if you want to do this, you can do it today. Otherwise, you cannot do it forever. I think this is, although he's too blunt, I couldn't say that as a diplomat, but I think he touched the point that, this is a huge opportunity for the developing countries to catch up with the digital transformation. Everyone has opportunity. Of course, you mentioned the issues is very important, the standards. WTO has no substantial role in negotiation of the standards, but we have the TBT committee, which we can take advantage to give the opportunity of the members to review and notify of those standards. This is a good mechanism. And with regard to the Article 21, I think in the future reform of WTO's dispute settlement mechanism, the only way is that unilaterally the members, especially the big ones, need to have self-constraint about using any trade measures related to national security. And multilaterally, there should be a consensus again, not use this national security and put it in the corner. I think that is the best approach we can expect. With the last question about the focus of the bilateral agreement in the MC13, I'm quite optimistic that because the negotiation is undergoing in Geneva, there's a hope that some GSI, like the investment facilitation, can be brought back to the multilateral trading system. But I would like to take this opportunity to mention that there are some very creative ideas about the future's multilateral agreement. In last year's MC12, when members discussed about the moratorium of electronic transmission, to not to levy duty on those electronic transformation, some members object, only a few members. At that time, in the green room, my successor, Ambassador of China, Ambassador Li, mentioned a suggestion that can we give those opportunity for those members an opportunity to opt out. You could not join this consensus, but we still have this multilateral agreement. And the Minister of Singapore says it's a good idea. And Dr. Ngozi said it's an interesting idea. And the EU said it's good. Japan said it's good, but we have the concern if too many people, so we would like to opt out. So this is, finally, it didn't happen because finally those 2 or 3 members give up their objection. We have the agreement on the extension of the moratorium. But I think it's enlightening. In the future, we can have this approach. If someone say, no, we don't like it, you can opt out. But this is the multilateral decision. If you opt out, you cannot object this. It's still a multilateral agreement. It's maybe a soft one, but it's still within the framework of a multilateral trading system.
Thank you very much. We're running over, so Danny, do you have one point you want to make?
I want to pick up on the question that Shiro and Mr. Yeo raised on how plurilateral approaches might work for national security considerations and environmental issues. Most things in the world, size doesn't matter. When you look at the richest countries in the world, all the richest countries in the world are, in terms of per capita GDP, are actually tiny countries, like Singapore, Switzerland, Norway. There's one exception to that, which is the United States. The United States is pretty much the only big, rich country. Now, the reason I say this is that economies of scale matter in certain activities and not in others. Economies of scale matter for national security. No amount of grouping together of small nations will match a large nation. economies of scale matter in global public goods like environmental issues. For those activities where economies of scale are so important, likely a plurilateral approach is not going to be so fruitful. And we need to focus on those activities for which plurilateral arrangements will be beneficial, and keep in mind how we can construct alternative structures that work for the larger big nation issues. Thank you.
Thank you, that's great. Could you please join me in thanking Ambassador Zhang and Professor Kuan?
Thank you.
At this point, we separate from our online global audience. Let me turn it over to our MC to speak of the transition.
Thank you. Thank you, His Excellency, Mr. Zhang, Dr. Posen, and Prof. Danny Kwa for the insightful conversation. With that, we have come to the end of our first session, and you're right.